I'm really pleased to welcome Richard Reeves as our evening keynote speaker. Richard is a public intellectual, best-selling author, and influential social commentator whose work centers on two vital questions. Where do inequalities persist in society today, and how can we most effectively address them? Richard was named one of America's top 25 thinkers by Politico for his incisive examination of class dynamics in contemporary America, explored in his book, Dream Hoarders. His latest book, Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It, was hailed as a landmark by the New York Times and recognized as a Book of the Year by President Obama, The New Yorker, and The Economist. Richard's forensic analysis of societal trends, including class, race, gender, health, and family life, deliver critical insights that shape policy, inform politics, and influence culture. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, as well as president of the American Institute for Boys and Men and chair of the UK Institute for Boys and Men. Before Richard, to provide some opening remarks and situate us for an exciting discussion, is Oksana Kischuk, who's the Director of Strategy and Insights at Abacus Data. A nearly decade's worth of experience in the market research industry, Oksana combines her passion for data and the curiosity to create impactful research plans and cultivate new practice areas. So first we'll hear from Oksana and then we'll hear from Richard. Welcome.
Thank you, Sabrina. I have just a quick few 3 data points just to set the stage for the Canadian context for this evening's conversation. I'll be nice and quick so we can get to the main event of tonight, but just a few pieces to set the stage and things that we're hearing so far. So the first piece to consider is that we do see evidence of a political divide happening within younger generations, with men trending right and women trending to the left. This was seen in our most recent election campaign in a lot of the data that we collected throughout the campaign. Young men, so that 18 to 29-year-old cohort, were 10 points more likely to vote Conservative than their female counterparts, and women were almost twice as likely to vote NDP as men in the same age bracket. Not only is this a large gap that we saw, but it's also unique. Gaps this big between men and women only existed between young people in this last election. For boomers, Gen X, even millennials to some extent, they were much more aligned in their beliefs of who they were more likely to vote for. The next piece that I wanted to leave you all with is that this more generationally driven divide goes beyond vote and political affiliation. Young people, including young men, are feeling more disconnected than ever from their network and society overall. Half of young men in one of our more recent studies reported feeling lonely and expressed feeling lonely, which I think is a whole other piece of the conversation. And 1 in 3 young men felt that democracy is something that's not fair for everyone. So moving forward, I think this is really about how we have this conversation, which I'm very excited to hear a conversation on this and learn a lot more about this evening. But we have a sense of that young men and young women, to some extent, are leading the conversation on the and, not or, when it comes to these narratives. For example, another one of our most recent studies, this one on DEI, we did some research on whether Canadians thought DEI was good, bad, or neutral for themselves, for society, and for our Canadian economy. This research was a little bit surprising to me and maybe might surprise a few of you as well. It suggested more so that young men are ambivalent to DEI more than against DEI policies and the language of DEI. And what we found also interestingly was actually the biggest opposers of DEI in this concept are men 45 and up, not young men. So I think some dimension to the conversation that we're going to have today. The last piece that I want to leave you with is hot off the online panel press just in today for some of our more recent research, that a strong majority, so 80% plus, of men, including young men and women, say that true equality is about supporting everyone, and that gender equality means men are given support just as much as women. So with that and those few pieces of data, it's my pleasure to welcome Richard Reeves to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here and everybody in the exchange that involved in getting me here. It's a real privilege. In case you're wondering about the accent, I do live in East Tennessee in the southern US. From the UK originally. I became a US citizen in 2016. And so I actually have dual citizenship now. And so in 2016, I was able to vote in both the US presidential election and the Brexit referendum. Draw your own conclusions. And I'm going to be very brief in my opening remarks because I'm really anxious to get into the conversation and to get your questions as well. But I just will pick up one point from Oksana's presentation, which is the how we have this conversation. And I think the conversation about boys and men and the struggles that they're having is a necessary one, an essential one. But how that conversation is had is crucial. It has to be had in a non-zero-sum way. It has to be had in the and rather than the or way. It has to be had in a way that in no way takes away from the ongoing necessary work for women and girls. I think that zero-sum framing has been a terrible trap for the whole discussion of gender. I think it's led to lots of people on the political right feeling like in order to advocate for more work on behalf of boys and men, you have to somehow turn against the progress of women and girls or be less committed to women and girls. And on the political left, there's been a sense that to actually come out and work on issues of boys and men is somehow to lessen your commitment to the concerns of women and girls. And I think that's led us to some of the gender gaps you've just heard about. The gender gaps in the US between young men and young women are, if anything, a little bit wider. And the younger the men and women, the wider the gap gets. And in the same way, in the US, they're also unprecedented. It's unprecedented to see such a big gender gap within a generation. And we'll get to that. But what I'm going to use my just few opening moments for is just not to get out the whole agenda. I think we're going to get into that in the questions. But just to put some facts on the table. So the challenges for boys and men are real, as I've just said, and how we have the conversation has to be based on some facts. This is C.P. Scott, who was the founder of the Manchester Guardian, that became The Guardian, and then owned The Observer for a while, and where I was a journalist for 5 years. And this is Scott's quote: "Comment is free, but facts are sacred." Comment is free is still the name of the opinion section of The Guardian. But I think the second part of that is pretty important too. Whatever we end up talking about, I think getting some facts straight and some facts on the table is very important. And that has been a bit of a challenge around some of the issues for boys and men. So I'm going to share some data on mental health, and I'm going to share some data on suicide rates, just so you know that's coming. All of this data is US data. I do know a little bit about some other countries, but not enough to claim to any expertise. Although I was very glad you mentioned the UK's brand new centre on policy research on men and boys, of which I'm chair and which we launched only last week with the Labour Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. As I've said, this is not a zero-sum game, it's and, not or. So I'm going to have some data points on basically one or two data points on just each of these to get us going. So in terms of mental health in the US, there's a mental health crisis among young people. I use the word crisis carefully and sparingly, but I think in this case it's true. So let's look at suicide rates among young women of these different age groups, basically for the first 20 or so years of this century. You can see that suicide rates rose. This is just rates for women of all of those different age groups. And that's quite rightly been a cause of concern. And now I'm going to show you the data for men over exactly the same time period with the same data. And you can see that there's been a very significant rise among male suicide rates. In the US, male suicide rates are 4 times that for women. And we lose, in the US, 40,000 men a year to suicide, so it's a public health problem of a significant magnitude, and one that it's been sometimes difficult to get attention to. But some of our more recent work shows that up until 2010, what this data shows you is what was the rise in suicide rates for men by age group up to 2010, the decade leading up to 2010. And as you can see, really all the rise in that middle age group, so this is by age from young on the left to older on the right, it's really those middle-aged and older middle-aged men where we saw this really massive spike in suicide rates in the first 10 years of this century. And that's consistent with the story about the economy, deaths of despair, etc. But since 2010, the suicide crisis in the US has taken on a very different feel for men. This is just male data. This is since 2010 up to 2023. And as you can see, like, blessedly leveled out for those middle-aged men, didn't particularly go down, but all the rise has really been on the left. There's a kind of up and down on the right tail, but if you just look on the left, you can see that suicide rates among young men have risen by about 1/3 in the US just since 2010. That's a very significant rise. So again, one we haven't seen. And we had a bit of a story about the economic causes of male suicide up until 2010, but the story about young males is a little bit harder to tell, I think. And one of the challenges we're currently facing, I think it is related to issues around isolation, loneliness, etc. Work by Fiona Shand and her colleagues found that the two words that men are most likely to use in reference to themselves before taking their own lives is either useless or worthless. And so there is something, obviously that's a tragically self-selected group of men, but nonetheless, I think there's this sense of genuinely coming to believe the world will be better off without you than with you. And obviously that has huge ripple consequences. On education, again, you're going to have similar data in Canada, but I'm just going to focus on higher education because I think that's a bit easier for us to get our heads around. In 1971-72 in the US, there was a gender gap in favor of men in getting college degrees, about a 13-point gap. We passed Title IX in the US, which is a big piece of federal legislation to promote women into higher education. And as you can see, that 13-point gap, I think a gender gap of that order should actually trouble policymakers. And here's what's happened in the years since. So we now have a slightly bigger gender gap in higher education in the US than we did in the 70s, but it's the other way around. So to put it slightly differently, the gender gap on US college campuses is bigger today than it was when we passed Title IX in 1972. It's just reversed. All kinds of reasons for that, not for the same reasons, not with the same consequences, for sure. But nonetheless, this is a story that we can see across the education system in the US, where if there's a gender gap, then it's going to be one where boys and men are behind women and girls. And in wages and work, I think I'm going to bring a class dimension at this point, because this is a huge element to this, which is if you look at what's happened to, this is basically women with a college degree. So non-working class is the definition here, which just, we define working class for the purposes of this analysis as with or without a college degree. And so this is women with a college degree. And it's a straight line, just beginning and end. What's happened to their wages over that time trend here from the late 70s up to most recent data? It's gone up quite a bit. It's also gone up for men with a college degree. And you will notice that the gender gap hasn't dropped very much between those groups either, right? So two things can be true at once. But what I really want to draw your attention to is those without a college degree. So this is women without a college degree who've seen a small rise in their wages, and this is men without a college degree. And so men without a college degree in the US, which constitutes the majority of men, don't earn any more today than they did half a century ago. Women without a college degree earn a little bit more. And as you can see, there's just a class gap here that intersects with the gender gap in a way that I think is incredibly important for everybody to understand. And then the last piece of data I'll share is just on the changing dynamics of family. And in particular, the way in which it's no longer the norm in the US to have children within marriage, particularly for those, again, without a college degree. And so if we look at what's happened to births outside marriage, this is those with a college degree. So this is coded on the mother for data reasons. So you can see that there's been a doubling in the share of children born outside marriage. That's what this is. The percentage of kids born outside marriage to women with a college degree has doubled. But it's still only 11%. It's still only 1 in 10. So sure, an increase, but that's not the story. The story is for the other groups. And so it's now, for those who don't have a college degree, the norm is to have your child outside of marriage rather than inside marriage. Now, these are just facts. Why am I sharing these particular ones on family? Because I think that for a very good reason, we have fundamentally transformed the economic relation between men and women. As Gloria Steinem famously said, the point of this is to make marriage a choice for women rather than a necessity. I think that is a glorious goal. I'm not saying we're quite there yet, but we've made massive progress towards it. And as a result of which, the role of fathers, the way that we raise our kids, the economic relationship between men and women has fundamentally altered in a very short period of time. I think, I just had this argument with my wife the other day where I said, well, just in 50 years. And she said, you can't go around saying just 50 years. Just because you're 55 doesn't mean everybody else thinks that's I think that's a blink of an eye. That some of you might be thinking that's a really long time to have not closed some of these gaps. But culturally speaking, it is a really short period of time. And so we have actually, for mostly really good reasons, fundamentally altered the economic underpinnings of gender relations. That is, as I've said, for mostly a very good reason, but we should not be naive about the fact that that then puts a question mark next to the role of men. And as a result, I think many men, including many young men, are asking themselves the question, what am I for? what does it mean to be a man today, in a way that their fathers and certainly their grandfathers simply didn't have to ask. And that question is going to be asked with increased urgency by young men. It's already being asked. The question here isn't whether we're going to have this conversation. It is, as Oksana said, how we're going to have it. But just as importantly, who's having it? The conversation about modern masculinity is going to dominate politics for the next few years. And I think it would be better if as many of us were in it as possible. That's certainly what's motivated my work. So with that, I'll close out. I'm looking forward to the next session. So thank you for your attention. I'm a bit worried now because last time she waved me off the stage. Did you see that before? She's like, no, women first.
Yes. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you, Oksana, as well. Okay, we're excited to have a conversation now about what we've heard, and facilitating this conversation is Jonathan Montpetit. Jonathan is a senior investigative journalist with CBC News, where he covers social movements and democracy, holding a graduate degree in political science from LSE and McGill University. In 2021, he was also a Southam Journalism Fellow at Massey College. Welcome, Richard, Jonathan, and Oksana. Oksana was already here.
Thanks, Richard, for that great overview of your research. If you haven't read Richard's book, it's really quite fascinating. Highly recommend. I want to begin by just saying, so I was texting with a friend earlier this week, and she has a fairly senior position at a unnamed media organization. And I mentioned that I'd be moderating this event, and I sent her a screen grab of the cover of your book. And this was her response, quote, "Oh Lord. Interesting, though. Men have 4 difficult years, and all of a sudden there are 1 million books. Women have 15,000 bad years, and meh." Now, she hadn't read your book, and that's an important caveat because your take is sufficiently nuanced. But she was, I think, reacting to the subject matter and reacting to the conversation. I think that's transpired since you've published the book, and the book was published, correct me if I'm wrong, 2022. So how typical is a reaction like that to the subject matter of the book? And why do you think we should be having this conversation anyway?
Right. Thank you. Great opening question. I hope that your friend is going to watch this. So that is quite a common reaction. I think that it's very often being thought, even if it's not being said. And so I appreciate it being said. I think that there's an inevitable reaction among many people, especially many women, to this discussion, like almost a visceral one. Like I think that at some level, like if you're sitting there as a woman and you've got this guy saying, "We need to care about men. What about men? Look at men. Men are struggling." There's a good chance that just almost physiologically you're reacting, right? This is uncomfortable. I think that discomfort is not only inevitable, it's honorable. I think there is a necessary discomfort to this conversation. The trouble is that because of that discomfort, too many of us have decided not to have it. That doesn't mean someone's not. That doesn't mean everybody else has gone along with it. What it's meant is that we have vacated the ground. We have ceded the ground because it's hard. It's a hard conversation to have. It's hard to hold 2 thoughts in your head at once. It's hard to say, look, we can care about boys and men and do this work, and there are still issues we need to focus on for women and girls. We're not abandoning that. That is a very hard thing to do. But because it's hard, doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. In some ways, it's essential that we do it if the problems are real, because otherwise someone is going to come along and fill the gap that we just chose to leave. And so I understand and honor the discomfort, but I think that for too long it has prevented us from having a good faith conversation about this, and that has led us in part to where we are now, because if there are real problems in a society, and I think some of the problems facing boys and men are real, they're not confections, and they are not taken seriously by responsible people, then irresponsible people will exploit them. I think that's always been true, and I think it's happening with men now.
I want to return to the exploitation element a bit later, but what I want to do now, is drill down a bit further in some of the data you've gathered, and you kind of gave us a really nice overview, but I want to kind of draw you out a bit more about how men are struggling when it comes to education in the labor market. And particularly, I think one of the really interesting things about your book, which I didn't appreciate until I read it, is you drill down, and race and class are important parts of the story. And I would love if you could touch on that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to use the word intersectionality with apologies. It's an ugly word for a good idea, which is to think about the ways that different aspects of our identity intersect with each other. So it could be class or sexual orientation or gender and so on. And if you apply an intersectional lens to this work, what you find is that many of these issues, some of which I just briefly put on some slides, they vary very much by class and by race. And so, for example, the education gaps are just much bigger for working class communities and for black communities in the US in particular. The US has a specific issue for black boys and men, like anti-black racism in the US, and the nature of our housing market and so on means that the sharp end of this, many of these problems is faced by black boys and men, but it's also true for working class men from rural areas. I live in southern Appalachia now. The county I live in has a male labor force participation rate of 45%. It is not a place where the men are really flourishing in many cases, so it's important to bring in a geographical dimension to it too. That isn't to say that some of these issues around some of the more cultural questions of identity and so on, I think they are playing out across society, across some of these class and race gaps, but I just think it's easier to navigate some of these changes if you've got more economic resources, more opportunity. And you saw the chart on wages. To say it really bluntly, I think that navigating this new world is just easier for men with money and more education. And then there's a bit of a tendency to look at the men who are maybe struggling to navigate this new world with a degree of contempt and just be a bit more like, well, why can't he be more like us? We're very enlightened men, we've figured it out. And so I think that's too quick, that move. And because we have such divisions, we're very often struggling to look across them and see that just because the men around us maybe don't fall into some of these categories, it doesn't mean that all men are. But I would say some of these issues like mental health and so on really do play across these lines.
It kind of goes unmentioned in your book, but you get a sense when you flash some of the charts. And my question really is about the timeline here. And when we talk about the struggles of men, and particularly in certain classes, certain regions, and in certain races, is this a problem of a post-industrial society? What is the historical context for understanding these challenges?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few things that have happened coincidentally, and that's sometimes I think it's difficult for people to get their head around. So I think that what we've seen is a huge shift in the structure of the economy, for one thing, away from more of an industrial economy, and that has disproportionately changed the labor market for men, right? And so the job that your father did or your grandfather did may not be there now, and it's certainly not there if you've got relatively modest levels of education. That's a big change. So some of those long-run changes in the economy have definitely changed the labor market for men. At the same time, what we've seen is women entering the labor market. Actually, very few women have actually had this issue of well, I want to do the job that my grandmother did. Or if they did, it would have been a very different kind of job. But generally, it's a very different world, right? There is because women's entry into the labor market in big numbers has been, I'll say it again, relatively recent, by which I mean in the last few decades. That's a very different world. But that second point, which is this fundamental economic rebalancing between the position of men and women, that's a cultural shift. It's an economic change. The rising economic independence of women, and I used this Gloria Steinem quote earlier, has coincided with a more difficult economic situation for men, but it's not the cause of it. I think that that's the thing people really struggle with, which is that they can see like the rise of women in the labor market, women's earnings and so on. They can see men struggling and they go, well, look, obviously, right? The women are doing better, that's why the men are doing worse. That's just completely untrue. But you can imagine how that could actually be a story that's being told, especially in certain circles. They have coincided, however. And I think that the naivety that particularly people on the center left tend to have about this is just to think that this isn't going to be a difficult transition for many men. Like it just is going to be difficult. And I'm afraid that just rolling our eyes or just saying, "I'll get over it and get it with the program" is that hasn't worked.
I want to pick up on some of the data that Oksana shared with us, and so she mentioned this big kind of gender gap where young men are turning right, young women are either staying or turning left. And this is something we saw in Canada, but we see it in Germany in recent German elections, South Korea, and of course in the recent U.S. elections. What do you think is behind this trend?
Which one? The move of women to the left or the move of men to the right?
Let's start with men. But
okay. I know more about men than women.
Yeah,
right?
I want a holistic answer, though.
Okay. Well, I would just say I'd make a general point, which is I think there is a reason to really worry about that trend regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. I really worry because what I think is fueling that leftward shift among women and men, I think there's a similarity here. So maybe this is a kind of unified theory, but which is that young men are being convinced by more conservative voices that their problems are real, which is true, and that it's the fault of feminism and women, which is not true, but sounds plausible. And young women are being persuaded, particularly by voices more on the left, that they face all kinds of problems in a patriarchal society, etc., and it's all the problem of men and toxic masculinity and mansplaining and sexism and discrimination. Like, it's really striking to me that like young women in the US are more likely to think that the gender pay gap is the result of direct discrimination by men than older women, even though much less of the pay gap is explained today by direct discrimination. There's much less direct discrimination than there was, but young women are absolutely convinced that's why women earn less. It's not true. And so I'm trying to be even-handed here and say that I think there's a danger that each side is trying to persuade young men and young women that A, your problems are real, but B, it's the fault of that lot over there. That drives a really strong cultural division. And the reason that troubles me from a broader democratic perspective, if you like, is there's a lot of political energy going into gender politics right now, which could be being devoted to the housing market, the education system, political systems, etc. And so I find it quite tragic, actually, that just at a point in economic history where you'd really want young men and young women linking arms and working together, they're actually pointing fingers at each other and blaming each other. And I think that's in some ways the real tragedy, is that that's just a waste of political energy. But I do think it's being driven by some of these but each side thinks they're going to be helped by driving more young men or young women into their camp. But in the end, that creates a divide that I think is really potentially quite bad for our culture.
Why does it consume so much energy? Like, what is there something about gender that demands our attention more so than the housing crisis, say?
It's so personal. I mean, the personal's political and the political's personal. But I mean, obviously, we've had a series of moves, especially in the US recently. We've had various changes in the policy environment. We've had the election of Donald Trump, the Me Too movement, the Women's March, the fall of Roe. There's been a lot going on the gender front. We've also seen an explosion of a whole new media environment, which we'll probably get into, which I think in some ways can be good in terms of engaging more people, but it can also fan the flames of the gender war. And I think all of those things have happened at once. But I think it's because this is really personal. Like we were talking a little bit earlier before we came on stage about how like a lot of women start to worry about men when they start to think about having kids with someone or getting married. They start looking around and going, and so this is quite visceral. This is about who we are as people. It's about, are we going to form families? It's about how we walk around in the world. It's about our identity in, I think, quite a profound way. And so I think it actually touches nerves in ways that I think are really important. And there's this nice line from Ezra Klein, many of you probably know his work from the Times, where he says, "Nothing makes me more Jewish than anti-Semitism." And I think that there's something about threatening an identity that makes people really lean into it. And I see a lot of that now. This is part of the answer to the earlier question, which is I think that one of the reasons why young men, I think, are more open to an appeal from, say, the right, is they feel as if the left see them not as having problems, but as being the problem. Like the term toxic masculinity didn't exist till 2016. I think that's important historically, right? And so there's a sense, I think, among a lot of young men that's like being, to some extent, pathologized. We can agree or disagree about the substance of that claim, but that's the feeling that a lot of young men are expressing, and I think that's led them to be more open to a conservative pitch.
Kind of like a backlash politics.
Yeah, I don't like the term backlash, unfortunately, because but I haven't come up with a better one, so why don't I like it? I think I don't like it because it sounds more pejorative than I want to be. I think that the votes of young men are up for grabs in a way that they haven't been before. They've typically been more reliably on the left. So I think they're just kind of open to different offers, and I think they're the new swing voters in many ways, which means I think it could swing back. But it's very interesting to me that depending on which kind of audience I'm in, if you're in a more sort of center-left audience, the question's always framed as, why are young men moving to the right or being drawn to the right? And I was like, are you quite sure that they're not being pushed away from the left? It's interesting how you frame that, right? It's much easier if you're on the left to say, these young men are being radicalized by people and going off to the right, and like they're being drawn to the right, right? They're being drawn. You're quite sure they're not being put off by you? Right? Maybe they just don't see anything for them in your offering, right? And that's a more uncomfortable conversation, and therefore not one that people on that side of the aisle typically want to have.
Let's have that conversation. So, why would the left, or describe to me that narrative. Describe to me that narrative in a bit more detail. How is the left pushing young men away?
Well, they just haven't, they've typically not had, there's a couple of things. Like one is, I do think some of the language around of pathologization is true, right? And we can talk about how overstated it is, but like there has been this sense, growing sense of like, in a way, personalizing the problems of gender inequality. All right, I think that's been an interesting move. One of the things I really liked about the women's, and still like about much of the women's movement, is its focus on structural questions like the way the labor market works for people with caring responsibilities. But the move in more recent feminism has been more towards like male behavior, in particular male misbehavior. It's been about toxic masculinity, mansplaining, etc. It has been more about the ways in which men themselves conduct themselves in the world. And I'm not saying there wasn't really good work in there. There was, especially in the Me Too movement. But the trouble is, taken too far, what that ends up feeling like, as if the women's movement is being fueled much more by a critique of men than a critique of the structures of our economy and society. And so that, I think that's one. And the second thing is that there just hasn't been very much on the table for men from the left. That's particularly true in the US, where I know a lot more about the political context. But the Democrats ran as the Women's Party in the last election, I mean, almost explicitly. And they didn't offer anything on any issues that they thought were going to affect young men. And they were very clear that they thought that would be a distraction. They thought they were going to win off the backs of the votes of young women. And one quite senior Democrat operative said to me in the run-up to the election, we know we're not going to do very well among young men, but we don't think they're going to turn out. Our young women are going to turn out, right, because they're so mad as hell about Trump and Roe. We're going to turn out these young women, and the young men won't, and it's a direct quote, the young men won't be bothered to get off the sofa in the basement to vote. That turned out to be a fatal miscalculation. And it was pretty denigrating of young men as well. It was like, yeah, well, they won't turn out, so we don't need to worry about them. So we don't need to offer anything to them. And so the cupboard's been pretty bare, just from a policy point of view, on the left towards men, certainly in the US.
I want to circle back to something else that Oksana mentioned in her remarks. So she shared the statistic that half of young men are feeling lonely, and a third say they don't trust democratic institutions. Is there a democratic engagement issue among men? And I kind of ask that because, again, it's one of those gut check moments where you look at politics, and you're like, man, there's a lot of dudes in politics. Like, it is not a realm of society that is thought to be very friendly to women.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about this is that I think there is a problem of civic lack of engagement among men, which is maybe upstream of some of this democratic disengagement. And you see that in all kinds of areas of life, even just something as simple as kind of volunteering, community work, etc. And I think what seems to happen with men in particular is that if they end up being quite decoupled from one institution, say the family or the labor market, they seem to decouple across the board. It's like a generalized decoupling, whereas that doesn't seem to happen with women quite as much. And so what happens is there's been a bit of a deinstitutionalization of life for many men. And I think that can then lead to a space in which you don't trust or believe in institutions generally. And so I see this as part of a growing skepticism generally about the role of institutions, which is certainly not restricted to men. But I think it's deeper among men. And I wonder if that isn't partly because of this just sense of, I don't think we've done a good enough job in the new world of much greater gender equality of making sure that there is still a civic call to men. And I've come to believe that that's a really important thing, that actually unless kind of men are called, they won't necessarily come. And for reasons we could argue about forever, it just seems to be a bit less true of women. And I'll go one step further and say that I think to some extent, well, let me start with a quote from Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. She said, every known human society has rested on the learned, nurturing behavior of men. And by nurturing, she didn't just mean in kind of a very intimate sense, but more generally caring. The learned, nurturing behavior of men. She went on, this behavior, because it's learned, is very fragile and can disappear very quickly in circumstances that no longer teach it effectively. And I think that we've struggled to find a way in this world of much greater gender equality to still find a way to make sure that men feel that they're still needed in our society. And I think feeling unneeded leads to loneliness, disengagement, and ultimately to really big mental health problems. And I think it's a difficult challenge that we face now. How do we make men feel needed as men, even as we support gender equality? But I think that is the challenge in front of us, and I don't think that our institutions have done a very good job of communicating that.
I want to talk more about institutions, and I want to read this passage that I came across from a Ralph Ellison essay. He said, for whatever the assigned function of social institutions, their psychological function is to protect the citizen against the irrational, incalculable forces that hover about the edges of human life like cosmic destruction lurking within an atomic stockpile. Now, one of the institutions that features quite heavily in your book, you touched upon it in your opening remarks, you've just hinted at it, is marriage, and by extension, the family. It's an institution that's undergone tremendous amount of change in the last 50 years or so. And you kind of, you talked about how men, with those changes, are now kind of asking themselves, what am I here for? Like, if it's not this, then what? Why haven't men been able to adapt to those changes in this kind of fundamental institution that we have? And what can we do to kind of help them to get with the program, so to speak?
Yeah. Whose program? Yes, okay. That's the thing. It's like, whose program do we want them to get with? But yeah, that's a great quote, by the way. I'm going to definitely steal that from you. There's another great quote from, I think it was from Geoffrey Dench, I think, a British conservative writer, where he said, the family may be a myth, but it is a myth that makes men tolerably useful. It sets the bar pretty low. But I think there's something true to that. And one of the most difficult things for me was I went back and I reread some of the kind of in the 1970s, there was a very strong counter-reaction to the women's movement from a lot of conservative, mostly men, conservative writers, who basically said, look, if the women's movement gets its way, women will become economically independent of men. Men will become a choice, as Steinem said. And if men aren't needed anymore, they'll become disengaged. In fact, the real fear was they'd become really criminal as well. We'd see massive social unrest. We haven't, I think, largely because of the internet. But actually, this is going to work out really badly for society because we don't want lots of men who aren't needed. And what was difficult reading that was I was increasingly convinced that they kind of had a point. What they were wrong about, of course, was that meant we should stop the economic rise of women. Of course, we shouldn't stop that, which was their claim. But I think they were right to the extent that there was a question then was going to be asked. Like, how do we adapt? Like, if for a very long time, one of the ways we've tied men into social institutions, bound them to social institutions, is through family, through fatherhood, etc. You can't unravel that in a matter of decades and not think there will be some bumps in the road. And so you use the term adaptation. I do think it's an adaptation issue. I think it's hard. I think culture lags. And what I lean very hard on is the importance of fatherhood, and the message that fathers matter even if the father's not with the mother. So the bit that I lose the left on is by saying dads are important as dads, and the bit I lose some people on the right with is saying, but they might not be married to the mum, they might not be living with the mum, and that's the modern world. And so we've got to find a new way to make sure that men are connected to the social tissue of society, especially through their children, but that doesn't rely on traditional marriage, and that certainly doesn't rely on the economic dependency of women on men. And that's the fundamental change that we've had, which is to reduce the economic dependency of women on men. And that has just created a whole new set of challenges. It's also exciting, potentially, like the opportunities it gives men to change their. I was a stay-at-home dad for a while. That was not a possibility for my dad. And so I do think there's a really big upside to this, so that gives us into paid leave policy, parenting, and a bunch of other stuff.
I'm kind of conscious of time here. So when discussing gender and politics, social media is obviously an important part of the conversation. There's been a lot of talk in the U.S. about the role of the manosphere and what role it may have played in the election of Donald Trump, and I'm just can see you glowering at me because anyway. So
well, I just hate that term.
It's a complicated term, but so let's define it vaguely, and I'll let you run with it however you want to take it. But a corner of the internet, largely podcasting or streaming channels that cater to men. Kind of the maybe the best known example, again, may quibble with it, but is Joe Rogan. I'm certainly talking a kind of more mainstream manosphere here. This is a long-winded way of trying to ask you about your appearance on Theo Von. So Theo Von, for those of you who may not know, sometimes considered a manosphere influencer. Donald Trump appeared on a show in the election campaign. Huge audience, something like 4 million YouTube subscribers. What was it like going on his show, and what did you learn about the appeal of these types of podcasts?
Thank you. I think the problem with the term manosphere is that who you put into it really determines a lot. And there's a very good report in many ways from November that I think it's just too capacious in its definition. And I think that if you do put in people like Joe Rogan or people like Andrew Tate, who if you're lucky enough not to know who that is a true misogynist influencer, then you just lose all credibility, I think, with people like my wife likes listening to Joe Rogan half the time, and she's like a hardcore professional feminist. So we have to be careful. But what I've learned, not just from being on a few others as well, and I've gone a little bit deeper into, we'll use manosphere for now with a couple of other guys as well, is first of all, the idea that those spaces which do exist and they do code a bit male, the idea that we should just vacate them, right? Just not go on them. I spend quite a lot of time now sort of brokering between some of those podcast people and people who I think would be good to go on there, because what the podcast hosts say to me is they struggle to get people who are kind of more center-left on there, because they say, oh no, they're part of the manosphere, you can't go on there. And so of course the only people that go on there are more people on kind of center-right, more conservative, who then influence the podcast hosts. They become more center-right, and they go, oh, you can't go on there. And so the cycle turns. And so I think it's incredibly important. And also, like, I hear sometimes like a really bad expert on, say, fertility, what's happened to fertility rates. I'm like, I know a really good woman on fertility. And so I get in touch with the podcast and try and broker that. We shouldn't cede the ground. But the big thing, I think, is to understand why people like Theo Von and others are so appealing in many ways to young men. And I have a couple of thoughts on that. One, it's very interesting that they are comedians. And we're in a world now where a funny person tackling serious issues is much more appealing than a serious person trying to be funny, for good or ill. The second thing is that they're long and very unstructured. It is two guys, it is mostly guys, you're right, it is two guys shooting the shit for a couple of hours. Let's be honest, that's what it is, right? And that's a very male-friendly form of interaction. And particularly if you feel as if the conversations in other spaces are very tightly scripted, there are certain very clearly demarcated no-go zones, there's something rather thrilling about two guys just sitting around, shooting it out, chatting. And I ended up arguing with Theo about a couple of things, right? And I changed his mind, I think, on one thing, and, you know, I don't know, but I think it's a way of interacting in the world that many young men feel that they're not getting enough of in their own lives. And so they become almost like observers of this way of interacting, which, again, I think codes a little bit male. I think that women can enjoy it too. I don't want to be misunderstood there, but I think there is something. You're right. It's a bit masculine in the way that they interact, but that's okay, or at least I think it should be okay. And if we make it seem like it's not okay, then we're not going to win these young men.
I'm going to ask you one last question, and this is to give the audience a chance to come up with your own questions, because we'll move quickly to the Q&A. You know, and I want to pick up on something you just said about these kind of male spaces. And when you were on Theo Von, you related this really interesting anecdote about you visiting a slate mine, I think, that your Welsh
Wow, you listened to the whole thing.
Oh yeah, all 2 hours.
Wow, this is a professional at work, ladies and gentlemen.
I take this job seriously.
Wow.
And you were talking about, you know, being down in this slate mine with, I think it was with your boys,
My three sons, yeah.
and kind of you know, and you admit, you know, being a bit nostalgic or a bit envious of the kinds of solidarity that would have been forged in these male-only spaces. And nowadays, the idea of a male-only space, as you also pointed out, is looked upon with a fair amount of suspicion. So I want to ask, how do we balance the importance of male spaces with principles of democratic inclusion?
Yeah, well, thank you for listening to that. It was, I was quite moved by that experience. So this slate mine is one that generations of my family have worked in. And I was there with my three sons, and right at the bottom of this huge, it was the biggest slate mine in the world for a while in North Wales. There are these little huts that the guys would spend half an hour in, and they would eat something and do politics, and they would sing, because it's Wales, I'm half Welsh, and you know, be together in this kind of small space with a fire. And I sat there with my sons, and I admitted, and this is almost embarrassing to say, but there was part of me that I sort of went back to that and thought, God, that must have felt really good. There is something really good about male solidarity and to being with men. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to be with women as well, and we don't want equality and so on too, but there's a beauty to it. And I think that we've got to not make the mistake of thinking that, like, we don't want all male spaces that where power is hoarded, where opportunities are shared. We don't want the old boys club. right? We clearly don't want that. But that doesn't mean, for example, and I've used this as an example, I don't think that means we have to get rid of the Boy Scouts, which we have in the US, right? Boy Scouts doesn't exist anymore. Girl Scouts still does. Boy Scouts doesn't. Scouting for America now and is admitting girls. And so I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake not to say that we can have some spaces for boys and for men to be with each other. There was a recent survey from Pew which found that most women who vote Democrat in the US think that all male social gatherings are a bad idea. And you can imagine what's behind that. I kind of get that, but I'm like, yeah, that's not a good development. Because actually I do think that male friendships and male solidarity is important. There's a beautiful SNL skit on this, if you haven't seen it, called Man Park, where the woman has to take her boyfriend to Man Park. And so I think because he doesn't have friends, and it's very, very funny. SNL are killing it on male issues, by the way. Their podcast health episode is also amazing. And the reason it's very good is because it's done in humor, but it's capturing something really real, which is that we have to find a way to embrace equality, to insist on equality, in fact, and to not have spaces where we're excluding people, etc., but not in the process to somehow make the very idea of a male gathering or of a male space intrinsically a bad thing. I think that has been a really bad development, and I think we can have both, and it's incredibly important not to make boys or men feel like they shouldn't find spaces and places to be with each other.
I'd like to now invite members of the audience to ask you some questions, Richard. Should have asked how we're going to do this. Oh, a microphone will magically appear before you.
Thank you, Richard. You mentioned you have 3 boys. I'm reminded of the story of Gavin Newsom talking about his son and how his son has become conservative under the culture of that household. And I'm curious, you don't have to reveal your own personal anecdotes about how you raise your sons, but I'm curious about the anecdotes you've heard about how people have been raising their sons, and what are the signals that you're watching for, and what are the interventions that work or have seemingly to be working?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, I think, to just, the importance of fathers. I think that's incredibly important. Male role models, a certain different way of being on average. Like, I'm just going to say this stuff is on average, right? I think part of the problem too is people just not being willing to accept the fact that you can have on average differences between groups. And on average, like more playfulness. I do talk in the book about the fact that we hired, when we did need some childcare, a male to do that, and he would like pitch a tent and they'd do their homework in the tent and then run around it and throw a rugby ball at each other and then do some homework again. It was brilliant. Really got this kind of male energy thing. The thing that so what you don't want to do is end up inadvertently treating boys like malfunctioning girls. Or vice versa, of course. So they're a little bit different, that's okay. I learned the hard way. Like, I really felt like one of my kids in particular was a square peg in a round hole in the education system, and I just rammed, hammering that in. And so creating space that doesn't in any way excuse like bad behavior, but that doesn't pathologize male behavior is incredibly important. And I'll just say, because it's obviously a big issue now around like online, and there's a famous documentary, as Keir Starmer in the UK refers to it, Adolescence, which is of course a work of fiction, which is this kind of fear among a lot of parents. What I've had a couple of times is that mums will come and say, like, I don't like my son's, like Gavin's son did, it's really moved to the right. And I had my own experiences with this with my own sons. I really moved to the right. And I just don't understand it. I feel like I've failed and I'm horrified. And I'm like, okay, well, describe your home environment. Describe, is it a pretty liberal home? They're, yes, incredibly liberal. And they go to an incredibly liberal school. And we have like statues of Ruth Bader Ginsburg everywhere, and weekly seminars on toxic masculinity. I can't understand why he's moved to the right. And so I think there is a little bit of truth to that too, which is that there's a bit of a danger that people almost drive it. And so when my own sons, I can talk about anecdotally, my youngest son said when I was finishing my book, "You have to write about Andrew Tate, Dad." I was like, "Who's Andrew Tate?" Well, how wrong was I and how right was my son? And I said, who is this? And so he said, oh, it's this guy. And so we watched the videos together and with my son's girlfriend. And then one of my other sons was really going through a bit of back in the old days when it was just Jordan Peterson who was the bad guy, right? The good old days. I was like, the trick, I think, is to respond with curiosity rather than contempt. To say, oh, that's interesting. Where'd you write? Let's watch that together. Let's discuss that. That's interesting. Maybe you'll learn something. Maybe you're not right about everything as the parent. So don't assume that just because they're interested in some of this content or some of this has come their way, that they're on the brink of becoming an all-out misogynist, right? If you assume that, they'll probably become an all-out misogynist because you'll push them into it. One of the things that the guys say online, a lot of these, the really kind of, I would say some of the darker forces online, they actually say in their videos, go and raise this issue with your mum or a teacher, right? Go and raise the issue of male suicide or the gender pay gap or whatever. Go and raise that and see how they respond. And I bet you they'll shut you down and say, how dare you? Go and try it now. Just pause the video, go try it. So the young man goes and does that. And he goes to his mum, he goes to his parents. So I'm not sure the gender pay gap's real. Actually, it doesn't seem to be real. How do you respond in that moment? That's what will determine whether he goes back to the laptop and says, yep, they were right, I got shut down straight away by a horrified mother or father saying, oh, I can't believe you'd say that, I'm raising misogynist, right? And so the moral panic actually is driving more of the boys away. So breathe, be curious, be open-minded without sacrificing your own values.
Thanks so much for your talk and also for your brilliant moderation. So I'm actually feeling pretty optimistic, though I know we're at the beginning of really exploring male vulnerability and creating positive communities around them. I do feel optimism. Where I feel quite a bit of worry is when you talked earlier about the economic issues facing young men specifically, especially in the face of automation. And I'm just wondering if you think that there really is political and corporate will towards wanting to create better economic futures and outcomes for these young men. I think many of them are trapped in their basements. I don't think they actually want to be there as basement dwellers online. I don't know that they can get out. What do you think?
You've done some reporting on this issue as well. I'm very anxious not to take all the questions if there's one you want to weigh in on, Jonathan. I also don't want to put you on the spot. So.
You're putting me on the spot.
You want me to take it?
You take it, and I'll if you.
I was just looking at some of your work around like the economic trajectories of young men. The honest answer is I don't know. But I don't think that's just young men. I mean, it is true that young men are facing some heavier economic headwinds on some fronts than young women, or not taking the same economic opportunities. It was very interesting. Gretchen Whitmer just did a speech on young boys and men. She pointed out that like 20% of the homes being sold in Michigan are to single women, only 8% for men, 2-to-1 female-male ratio in their higher education reconnect program. So she's working on those issues for sure. So I don't know. Here's the thing that I'm a bit worried about, which is this is probably the first time in human history when we've had so many disengaged young men and crime has gone down. That just doesn't happen. That never happens. It always goes the other way. Disengaged, this is what the conservatives were warning about in the 70s, like disengaged young men, that means more crime. Why have we not seen more crime? I think it's because of what you said, the internet, the basement. Now, what that means, of course, is that it's much less of a pressing social problem for politicians to deal with. They can lament the guy in the basement. They can lament the rise of various things, etc. But the guys are not, to a large extent, the ones who act out get the headlines, but the ones who check out are in the majority. And if they're in the basement, that means they're not on the streets breaking stuff and burning stuff and stealing stuff and hitting each other, right? But if they were on the streets breaking stuff and burning stuff and stealing stuff and hitting each other, you can bet it would be higher on the political agenda. I am not advocating for that, by the way. but you can imagine a very different world, actually, and so I think that the deteriorating economic trajectories of many young men is just not high enough up on the political agenda, because what we're seeing is a retreat of these young men, and that's just not as politically damaging in the short run, or at least they don't think it is, but it's much more damaging in the long run. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do want to kind of also put, or at least let's ask questions about what they are doing in their basement. And I think, so some of the work that the Samara Institute has done about the discussion online about politicians, especially how women politicians are treated online. And so maybe it's good they're not breaking windows, but if angry young men are making contributions to the public discourse via the internet that are problematic, that is, I think, or that needs to be in our horizon, because I think there's a very, certainly, I'll speak for Quebec. Something that's happened in Quebec is a large amount. About 4 years ago, everyone was quite happy with the amount of women who were elected to public office at the municipal level, and now a disturbingly large number of them have stepped away, have resigned, they've not completed their terms, burn out. And one of the issues that a lot of them mention is the amount of hatred that they face online. It's just unsustainable for them to continue in public life. I don't know, I'm making a correlation here, but that's just an observation I'd want to add.
I think that's a good correction, yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the particularly the insights around physical violence and the lines to crime. I think the question around something that I work on around tech-facilitated gender-based violence and the closure of public space, and in as much as it exists on the internet, is really important. But I take the point around public violence, which does tend to be more male, as private violence tends to be, violence against women tends to be more private. But as somebody who studied, conflict and thought about history of conflict and violence in that way, we do see that, there's a trend of a regressivism around gender, and I use gender here in an inclusive way to include LGBT community members. And so I wonder if you can talk about the importance, you mentioned the importance of not ceding the ground. That as we're seeing these anti-democratic trends, as we're seeing this rise of the political right, and the historic association of that with a regressivism around gender, how that ties into what is also, you're also describing as sort of coincidental economic trends.
Yeah, but it's interesting. I think there's even a difference within the young generation of men, by the way, on that question. I was very. We had a discussion earlier about who's a feminist now, right? And what does that mean, right? And if you tell people it means support gender equality, then everyone's a feminist. But if you just ask it bluntly, a lot of young men will say they're not, because they think it means something else. And then the question is what do you think it means then? And then we'll say, I think it's something that's anti-men, right? And we can argue about whether they're right about that or not, but you can see how they came to that conclusion. What I found interesting in the US anyway, and we have published some work on this, is that at least for the broader category of 18 to 29-year-olds, the attitudes of men towards basic questions of gender equality and just generally policy don't really seem to have shifted. There's some more disturbing evidence among high school age boys, actually, that's come out kind of recently. And I suspect if we could break the data within that broader category, I think you might see more of it in the 19 to 20-year-olds than in the 28 to 29-year-olds, because that's I know I keep coming back to this, but 2016 is a notable year for many reasons, but one of them is the birth of the term toxic masculinity, and so that's a long time ago for an 18-year-old. He was 10 when that term was starting to be bandied around, right? And he's voting for the first time. And so I think that's a good sign that I haven't seen, I don't think as a general proposition, most young men are turning against the basic ideas of gender equality. And I think I've got decent evidence on my side for that. Not, of course, some are, but most aren't. I think actually the data that Oksana shared is really useful on this. The issue is that too many young men feel like they're not included in that conversation, that it is or not and so that makes me quite hopeful that if we can, as many people are starting to do now, so yeah, we're doing stuff on men too. We care about men's health, we're doing issues around male education, etc. That will actually take some of the heat out of the claim that gender equality is only for women, which right now feels like too plausible a claim. And again, it's hard politically to pull this off. But I'm pretty hopeful, actually, that there's a sense that we've lost a generation of young men to reactionary views, and I don't see that yet in the data. Maybe I'm being too optimistic about it. So the regressivism you talk about, I think it's true for some, but I don't think it's true for most. And the trouble is, if we adopt that as a point of view, then actually young men hear that. Yeah, I'm very happy for you to come back. Do you want to send the microphone back? Yeah.
Totally get it. Totally see the ground.
Oh, great. Let's stop there.
I think the question I'm asking is around who's filling the void.
Who's what, sorry?
Filling the void.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about, because we are seeing the repeal of Roe, right? We are seeing attacks on the LGBT community and policy. I'm also American, so hence the we.
Right.
So that's also something you saw, for example, in the rise of Nazi Germany in terms of a regressivism around the idea of gender.
Yeah.
Not, and I'm saying that inclusively again, not as a pathologizing of men. I'm saying that, you know, the regressivism around gender may be equally damaging for men in that context. So I'm talking more about the sort of meta-narrative of the policy and and how that's diving into a gap that's being seeded by the left.
Yeah, I think the answer could be some of the mainstream politicians. I mean, I'm seeing people like Wes Moore, for example, actually stepping right. Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, is a former US paratrooper. He's very religious. He's very serious about his marriage. He's pretty progressive on a lot of different issues, right? He's like, he is not backing away from more traditional ways of displaying masculinity. Let's put it that way, right? And I think it's great. And he's now saying, and we can do stuff on boys and men as well. And I was actually begging. I mean, look, I'm not partisan. From a political point of view, I will work with whoever wants to work on this issue, but I did think that the Harris-Walz campaign had a huge opportunity to step into this work, not least because as a woman, people weren't going to be as suspicious of her going into it, but also in Walz, you had the first public school teacher to run for such high office, who was also a coach. And so couldn't he have done a thing about the need for more male teachers and coaches and male loneliness and male solidarity and women's reproductive rights? Couldn't they have done that? Would that really have so upset so many women? I really don't think it would have done, but they wouldn't go anywhere near those issues. They wouldn't touch them. And I think that that is a real problem. And I'm really pleased to see the mainstreaming of this issue now, because I think in the end it will be politicians, leaders, church leaders, etc.
Thank you both for your remarks and for the facilitated conversation. I think I really want to pick up on the last piece you just said, Richard, because on a microscopic level, when we think about this in our communities or we think about this in the workplace or wherever we might be, like I would love more insight into who should be taking the lead on maybe addressing these issues and picking up on this, and is it men, Generation X, who could serve as role models, have these conversations? Because I kind of take the point that was made earlier, you know, like, and to what Jonathan started this conversation. Women are here listening to this, acknowledging it as a problem, while also facing a regression of our own rights. So it's not like we've achieved anywhere close to gender equality. And so, you know, for a lot of women, especially millennial women, still fighting the good fight in gender pay gaps or promotions or whatever it might be. And so whose responsibility does it become to then take the lead on this issue? Is it women? Is it men? Is it leaders, community leaders? Is it parents? Where does that kind of start in terms of as a solution-oriented kind of focus?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that I don't think we should ask women to help out the men. I think women have got enough to do without solving male problems as well. I do think it has to be mostly men. I think that women have a role to play in honestly helping create the permission space for the conversation. Like a lot of men feel afraid to talk about it because they think that the women in their lives will not be happy about them talking about it. And so they'll talk about it in other ways. So I do think that for the women are just giving us space to do the work in good faith, whilst continuing to do the work on behalf of women. Who should do it? Everyone should do it. Like I'm very proud of the fact my son is a 5th grade teacher in Baltimore City. And one of the reasons I'm so proud of him is because I think one of the best answers to kind of unserious reactionary online figures is honest to goodness, real flesh and blood men in these boys' lives. I think they will believe their eyes, not their ears. But so why aren't we doing something about the decline in the share of male teachers in our public schools? For all the hand-wringing about role models, where are the public policies to increase the share of men in teaching and coaching, for example? So that, but also in our communities, in our churches, in our own families, and so on. So I think it does largely have to be men leading it. And the last point about doing two things at once, I think it's hard to simultaneously say, like, we need more women leading schools and more men in classrooms. But we do, right? We need both of those things. And unfortunately, I think that we've taken it as far as we possibly can, the idea that we can just continue to not explicitly address the male issues until we've solved all the female ones. I don't think that's working out well for us in any dimension. And so I honestly think I don't think we have any real choice now other than to say we have to do both. Because it turns out that a world of floundering men is probably not going to be a world of flourishing women, for all kinds of reasons, or vice versa, in case that still needs to be added. So I do think we're in this together, and we have to rise together. And that's in every family, in every school, in every community, in every policy, is to refuse the zero sum, refuse the choice, do both. It's hard, it's uncomfortable, as we said at the beginning, but neglecting the real issues of men is not going to help women, for all kinds of reasons that I think we've identified tonight.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that, for answering those questions, answering my questions, for all the work you've done on this topic. And I think
thank you for your thoughtful questioning and for listening through the Theo Von thing. I feel it was quite serious and quite boring. That wasn't your fault, that was my fault. As my son, the one I just mentioned, said, the motto of our institute, the American Institute for Boys and Men, our internal motto is keep it boring, because we want to keep it away from the culture war stuff. And as my son said, well, you're the man for that job, Dad. So I feel like I've been very on brand tonight. You've tried to make it more exciting.
You've been very boring,
but I
though,
failed.
yeah,
I failed. I've been on brand. But thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks everyone for showing up, for asking questions, and for the organizers of this really great event. It's really nice to be able to have a conversation like this.